suffering is grace. The event itself is largely irrelevant. It's our responses to the events that matter. We are back talking dat Vedantic on the Daily Vedantic. And today's episode, this one is on the radical A's. I've heard trauma described as it's like a paint can. It has no covering, is dropped, and the paint splatters so many areas in one's life that it takes a while to figure out just where all of the paint has splashed. All of the different areas of one's life that has been affected by a traumatic experience. So much of the time, there is a denial of the different areas, denial of the experience. Such a strong desire for it to have not happened. That you can barely even look at where all the paint has splattered. For about 2 years after my sister passed away when I was 15, she took her own life with a bout of major depression. And I went into our backyard and I was the one that found her when I was 15, about 8, 9 p.m. at night on December 21st, 2001. And for about 2 years after that, I had a dream every night that she was still alive. A lot of times it would be at our high school, where my freshman year, she was a senior. So it was really fun and we had a lot of interaction. The year before she passed away, just being at the same school. And she was like a second mother, being 3 years older, being the only girl in a family of 5. So 4 boys and her. And I was the only one younger than her. So a really special relationship. And I would have this recurring dream that we were in the street next to the parking lot of the football stadium and meeting there for her to drive us home. I would have the recurring dream that she was still alive so frequently that in the dream when I would say, wait, this can't be. Christiane, you died. How is this happening? I would have the dream so often that I would reference the previous dreams. Oh, no, this can't happen. In this, fantastical dream world, I was like, no, this can't happen. Oh, I've heard of this happening. Then it became, oh no, this happens often. People come back from the dead. This is a known thing. By the time you get to dream number 200 of it, seems to be a convention that exists. There was a refusal, denial to even look at all of the different areas that the paint splattered out of my life. Starting with the most obvious, that she was gone. But after 2 years, there was a growth in appreciation for the very thing that I would have never designed or wanted to happen in my life. And that's those seeds of appreciation within years would grow to the most appreciation that I have for anything that's happened in my life. An appreciation for the very thing that I would have done anything to make sure it didn't happen. What does this philosophy say about trauma or pain or suffering? The long and short of it is suffering is grace. But the long and long of it is this philosophy is a manual for living, for navigating life, for mastering the art of living, because living is a skill, an art form. If you want to do it well, it is an art form like any other. And this 8,000-year-old philosophy is the manual for doing it well. And with pain, suffering, or trauma being significant portions, significant parts of our lives, what does it say about these things? Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, he studied Vedanta daily. And he put these Vedantic principles in very easy to digest Western lens, but he was known for radical accountability. He's known for he's known for actually several amazing contributions in the world of psychology, but one of the most prominent is radical accountability for the circumstances in our lives. That prominent notion within his approach to the field of psychology is no accident or coincidence for someone that studied Vedanta so regularly. This philosophy, it calls us towards the radical A's, as I will refer to them. That is radical acceptance of one's circumstance. Not denial, not repression, not voluntary blindness, not overly optimistic, not overly pessimistic, realistic. As I said before, and a great philosopher once said, an optimist sees the light at the end of the tunnel. A pessimist sees the tunnel, but not the light. The realist sees the light at the end of the tunnel and the next tunnel. That radical acceptance of pain and suffering exists. Prepare for them. The radical acceptance of death exists and is inevitable for all of us. Prepare for it. That is not pessimism, that is philosophy. As Swami will often say in his lectures, the pessimist expects the worst, but the philosopher prepares for it. To expect the worst is pessimism and not that useful, but to be prepared for it is perhaps the most useful thing. Radical acceptance, radical accountability. How do you take accountability for something traumatic in your life? Or pain or suffering, car accident where your back is never the same, death of a loved one, death of a child. How can you take accountability for that? Well, you don't take accountability for the event. You take accountability for your inner state. The unhappiness that you're going through grief. Grief is natural. Don't be unhappy that you're going through it. It is nutrition for the soul, which we'll get to in a sec on suffering is grace. Grief is normal. What about an indulgence of grief? Years in, you're still grieving. It's interesting, the story of a widower approached Swami and said, Swami, my wife died and my life is in shambles. I can't believe that this happened. And I can't get myself together. And Swami, who was thinking in his 80s at this time, for someone that's going through this grief, who was in his late 60s, Swami said, come here, beta, which means child, come here, child. And he has this extremely empathetic approach to what this man is going through. And they're talking, and he says, Swami asks, when did she die? And when was this? And the man says, about 8 years ago. And then Swami switches on a dime and says, 8 years ago? Get your stuff together, man. It's been 8 years? Dude, remove all the pictures from the apartment of referencing you and her and move on with your life. Maybe potentially harsh, and maybe part of that's been lost in translation as that story has been retold, but these great polar opposites based on where that person is. If it's 8 days later, grief makes perfect sense. And the unhappiness, the suffering, the desire to not go through grief, that can create so much agitation within us. Desire for comfort instead of discomfort. That's what you can take accountability for. Preparing and investing in a worldview that thinks that there should only be pleasure, no pain. There should only be life, but no death. That's what you can take accountability for. Holding on to grief several years later. Holding on to it because you consciously or subconsciously crave the value in being the victim. That is the other extreme, where you're unhappy and agitated by how much you've oriented your life around that victim role. And all of the side effects of that identification or orientation years after. That is an extreme. But that is also something you can take accountability for. Even if the accountability is, I don't know who I'll be if I don't have this anchor in my identity that is at the root of so many conversations, so many relationships. I don't know what I'll be if I don't have that as part of my identity. And that attachment to that part of your identity, that is something you can take accountability for. Whatever state we're in, happy or unhappy, comfortable, uncomfortable, it takes radical accountability. That is why the word radical is in there, because it is quite radical to take accountability for the after effects of an event that you might have been innocent in. Maybe it's the accountability of the selfishness that led up to whatever pain or suffering you're going through. Maybe it's a divorce. You feel like you were completely in the right for months and months and months and years. But maybe this philosophical concept creates a tiny little wedge, tiny bit of daylight for you to say, okay, what could I take responsibility for? Radical acceptance. That event happened. The circumstance is happening. Radical accountability. I create my fortune. I create my misfortune. I'm the master of my soul. I am fully accountable for my internal state. Me and myself alone. And the third radical A, radical appreciation. This is when you really start to generate energy. This is from a radical appreciation for that suffering, that pain, or that trauma. You need to know your level. You can't skip steps. You can't jump to 8 days after death of a loved one. Just say, I hate this discomfort. I want to get to appreciation for it. You need to know your level, and maybe it's 2 years. 2 years of immense discomfort. But on the other side, in 2 years is, it's a grad school program. It's a snap of the fingers. It goes by pretty quickly in the grand scheme of things. But on the other side of it, you can foster, and this philosophy tells us to foster radical appreciation. Radical appreciation for every aspect of our life. The 3 daily practices are to question everything, to not take anything for granted, and to study and reflect daily. And on that second point, to not take anything for granted. It's not just, is your gratitude list sufficiently long to have gratitude for all of the obvious great things? This second point is even more valuable in the reverse. Are you looking at the things that seem like, from one vantage point, that seem like pain, that seem like suffering, that seem like avoidable discomfort? And can you choose to not take it for granted and say, actually, that pain, that suffering, it's grace. That lower back pain that activates you to start hitting the gym. 2 years later, you're like, I can't believe I enjoy working out. Oh, it was the pain that activated me. That suffering of death of a loved one. That then, from then on, perhaps that pain for 2 years, just to fully accept that it happened. From then on, every day, has tenfold the appreciation because you know how quickly it can all be taken away. Suffering with a health scare that then gives you the appreciation for the health you do have, the relationships you have around you to help you get through it. Can you take the things that would go in your ingratitude list, reflect on them long enough to where they flip and they go right to the top of your gratitude list? That is the radical appreciation side of the 3 radical A's. So what does this philosophy say about trauma or pain or suffering? It says the event itself is largely irrelevant. It's our responses to the events that matter. And the prescribed responses are radical acceptance, radical accountability, and radical appreciation. Perhaps in that order and perhaps in your own time. That's the beauty of ideals. You set your sights upon them, and they pull you towards them. That's today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.
you.